There's a part of Louisiana that does not appear on most maps in any useful way. The Atchafalaya Basin. 360,000 acres of swamp and bayou and bottomland forest running down the center of the state like a wound that never dried. Cypress trees rising out of black water, their knees breaking the surface like old knuckles. Spanish moss hanging so thick in some places that the light reaching the water beneath has been filtered through 20 feet of green before it arriving gray and cool and changed. People live in this basin, have lived in it for 200 years. French-speaking, mostly the descendants of the Acadian exiles who came south from Nova Scotia in the 18th century after the British decided they were inconvenient, who found this difficult, beautiful, unhealthy country and decided it was theirs, and who built in a culture so specific and so self-contained that 50 years of outside influence has not fully dissolved it. They call themselves Cajuns. The word derives from Acadian, the French, run through 2 centuries of Louisiana vowels until it arrived at something new. They fish. They trap. They farm where the land allows farming. They play music at Friday night dances that go until 2 in the morning. They eat food that people from other parts of the country describe with more enthusiasm than accuracy. They speak French at home and English when they have to, and a private mixture both in the middle ground where most of their daily life occurs. And they hold their grievances. This last quality is not unique to Cajuns. Every culture holds grievances. But there is something about the particular isolation of the bayou communities, the way the water separates parishes from each other, the way the narrow roads through the swamp limit access and egress, the way a family can live 4 miles from its nearest neighbor and yet be bound to that neighbor by a century of shared water and shared work and shared memory. That makes the holding of grievances feel different here. More permanent, more structural, like the cypress trees themselves, rooted in water that seems like it should not be able to support roots, holding nevertheless. In St. Mary Parish, in the summer of 1947, 2 families who had been rooted in the same stretch of bayou country for 100 years came to the end of what they were willing to hold. Their names were Boudreaux and Thibodaux, and what happened between them that summer was the kind of thing that the Basin country absorbed and remembered and did not discuss with outsiders for decades. Until now, the Boudreaux family came to St. Mary Parish in the 1820s. They came from the Acadian communities further east and settled along a bayou that the parish called Bayou Cypremort. The name means dead cypress in French, which tells you something about the landscape and about the French capacity for naming things with particular honesty that English sometimes avoids. They were fishermen and trappers primarily. The bayou gave them what they needed, catfish and crawfish and the muskrat and nutria whose pelts the fur market wanted, and later, alligator, and later still, oil field work when the companies came in the 1930s, and began looking at what lay beneath the swamp with the specific attention of people who had decided that what lies beneath is more valuable than what lives on top. By 1947, the Boudreaux family in St. Mary Parish consisted of 3 households within a mile of each other along the Bayou Road. The patriarch was a man named Edouard Boudreaux, called Dodo by everyone who knew him, which was everyone in a 20-mile radius, who was 64 years old and who had fished Bayou Cypremort for 50 years and knew every bend and shallow and deep hole of it with the intimacy of a man who had spent his whole life in conversation with a specific piece of water. Dodo had 2 sons, Marcel, 41, who ran the family's fishing operation and had, since the oil companies arrived, supplemented it with contract work on the drilling platforms, and Fernand, 37, younger and quieter and more prone to sitting on the porch at night listening to frogs than to working the double shifts that Marcel favored. He also had a daughter, Celeste, 34, who had married a man named Robichaud from the next parish and was largely removed from what was about to happen, though not entirely. Dodo's wife, a woman named Odette, had died in 1939 of a fever. He had not remarried. He had managed his household since then with the assistance of his sons' wives and a disposition toward independence that the Bayou country bred in men who had spent their lives making decisions without anyone nearby to consult. Half a mile up the bayou from a Boudreaux compound. Compound is not quite right, but there is no single English word for a particular arrangement of adjacent family households that the Cajun Bayou communities produced, sat the Thibodaux family. The Thibodaux had been in St. Mary Parish almost as long as the Boudreaux. They had arrived in the 1830s. a decade later, and had settled on the same bayou in a proximity that was partly geographical convenience and partly the specific social logic of French-speaking Catholic families who wanted neighbors who shared their language, their religion, and their relationship to the water. The patriarch in 1947 was a man named Rémi Thibodaux, 61 years old, who had a reputation, solidly earned by all accounts, of being the most competent trapper in the parish. This was not a casual distinction. In a community where trapping was a primary occupation, and where the skills that were passed down through families with the same seriousness that other communities passed down law or medicine, being the best trapper in the parish was a real thing. It meant something. Rémi had 3 sons, Claude, 38, Alcide, 35, and the youngest Theodore, called Théo, 29, and 2 daughters, both married to men from other parishes and effectively out of the story. The 3 Thibodaux sons were all in the trapping business with their father. Claude ran the line. Alcide handled the processing and sale of the pelts, and Théo did what he was told, which was partly because he was the youngest and partly because Théo had a quality that the family managed by giving him clear tasks and defined responsibilities. He was, in the vocabulary of the parish, vita and cholera, quick to anger, in a way that was not mean, but was also not reliable, and the combination of quick anger and the specific physical confidence of a 29-year-old man who had grown up in the swamp and knew how to handle himself was a combination that the family had learned to manage carefully. They had managed it carefully for 29 years. In 1947, the management failed. The history between the Boudreaux and Thibodaux families was not a history of conflict. This is important to establish because the story of what happened between them in 1947 can create the impression, in retrospect, that the conflict was inevitable, that the proximity and the competition for the same resources along the same bayou were always going to produce what they produced. They were not. For 100 years, the 2 families had shared Bayou Cypremort and its resources with a generally functional degree of cooperation. They had helped each other in the practical ways that bayou neighbors helped each other, lending equipment, sharing information about where the fish were running, pulling a boat out of trouble when the trouble was too big for one man to manage. They had attended the same church in the nearest town, had celebrated the same feast days, had danced at the same Friday night fairs. There had been friction over the years. There always was. The trapping territories had been a source of argument in lean years when the pelts were thin, and every man needed every line he could run. There had been an incident in 1931, during the Depression, when a Boudreaux man and a Thibodaux man had come to blows at a dance in a dispute whose origins were partly about a woman and partly about a trap line, and entirely about the combination of poverty and proximity and the specific volatility that those conditions produce in men who have nothing to spare. But the 1931 incident had been resolved, in the way these things were resolved in the parish. Not officially, not legally, but through the social mechanics of community pressure and the intervention of priests, and the shared understanding that the 2 families needed each other more than they needed to be right about whatever they were arguing about. By 1947, 1931 was 16 years ago. What happened in 1947 was something new. Théo understand the Boudreaux and the Thibodaux. You have to understand what the Chafalaya Basin does to people who are born into it and stay. It makes them patient, not passive. There is nothing passive about the physical work of fishing and trapping in swamp, which is relentless and demanding and conducted in heat and mosquitoes and the specific discomfort of wet work done in wet places. But patient in the deeper sense. Patient with time, patient with the slow rhythms of a landscape that operates on its own schedule and does not negotiate with urgency. The crawfish run when they run. The muskrat are thick in good years and thin in bad ones, and the man who has been watching the basin for 30 years knows which conditions predict which outcomes, and the man who has been watching for 20 years knows almost as much, and the man who arrived last year from somewhere else knows almost nothing and cannot be told. Can only learn by watching, which takes years, which is the point. The basin teaches you to wait. It also teaches you the specific relationship to violence that isolated communities develop when the official mechanisms of dispute resolution are distant and slow. Not that violence is preferred, but that the question of how to respond to injury when the court is 40 miles away on roads that may or may not be passable and the injury was done by a man you will see at church on Sunday regardless, becomes a private calculation rather than a public one. You decide what the injury cost. You decide what the response costs. You decide whether the ledger can be balanced privately, and if so, how. And you decide whether to carry the balance or to settle it, and what settling it means. Both families on Bayou Cypremort in 1947 were fluent in this calculus. They had been raised in it. They were conducting it through the year between the lease and the summer with the same patient thoroughness they brought to everything else. The tragedy was not that they were irrational. The tragedy was that they were both rational, and that their rational calculations applied to the same situation from two different positions produced a collision that neither fully intended and neither fully avoided. In the spring of 1946, a man from New Orleans arrived in St. Mary Parish with a briefcase and a lease form. He represented a fur company, one of the larger ones operating in the Louisiana wetlands market, based in New Orleans but with buyers in New York and London, that was expanding its lease territory in the Atchafalaya Basin as post-war demand for pelts recovered. He wanted to lease the trapping rights on a particular stretch of wetland adjacent to Bayou Cypremort, approximately 400 acres of prime muskrat and nutria habitat that had been, for the previous 2 decades, informally shared between the Boudreaux and Thibodaux families without any formal agreement. The lease he was offering was worth real money, not a fortune. But in the economy of St. Mary Parish in 1946, the annual payment represented more cash than either family typically saw from their own trapping operations in a single season. It was the kind of money that changed things, that paid off a debt or repaired a boat or sent a child to school in Baton Rouge. He could only offer it to one family. The 400 acres were, technically, adjacent to both properties. The informal shared use had never been documented. There was no legal clarity about who had the better claim. The New Orleans man was not particularly interested in resolving the question. He needed a signature. He would take the first family that gave him one. What happened next is where the accounts diverge. The Boudreaux family's account, as reconstructed from what Dodo told his sons, and what his sons told their children, and what eventually made it into the documentary record, is this. The New Orleans man came to the Thibodaux household first. Rémi Thibodaux told him the Marsh had been shared informally for years, that he would need to talk to the Boudreaux before signing anything, that common courtesy required it. The man thanked him and drove to Boudreaux. Dodo Boudreaux signed. The Thibodaux account, as reconstructed with equal reliability, is different. In their version, the man came to Dodo first. Dodo signed without consulting anyone. The Thibodaux heard about the signed lease not from Dodo, but from a neighbor who had seen the New Orleans car parked outside the Boudreaux house. Both versions agree on the outcome. Dodo Boudreaux had a signed lease. The Thibodaux family did not. And 400 acres of wetland that had been jointly worked for 20 years now belonged, legally, to one family. Whether the process was proper or not, whether Dodo had been first or Rémi had deferred and been betrayed by that deference, was a question that the two families would never answer to each other's satisfaction, because the answer required trusting the other party's account of a private conversation with a man who had returned to New Orleans and had no particular interest in being involved in whatever happened next. Rémi Thibodaux went to see Dodo Boudreaux the week after the lease was signed. The conversation between them was described by Marcel Boudreaux, who was on the porch and heard part of it, as the most careful and the most dangerous conversation he had ever witnessed. 2 old men, polite, formal, each one precisely measuring every word, each one perfectly aware that the politeness was the only thing standing between the current situation and something worse. Rémi said he believed there had been a misunderstanding. Dodo said he was sorry Rémi felt that way. But the lease was signed, and there was nothing to be done about it. Rémi said the Marsh had belonged to both families for 20 years. Dodo said it had never belonged to anyone. It was state land, and the state had leased it, and he had the lease. Rémi Thibodaux looked at Dodo Boudreaux for a long moment. Then he said, "Dodo, I've known you 60 years. I need you to tell me if you did this with bad faith." Dodo said, "I did what was available to me." Rémi Thibodaux left without saying anything more. Marcel Boudreaux said his father watched the old man walk back down the Bayou Road, and then went inside, and that evening he ate his supper without speaking, which was unusual enough that Marcel noticed it and did not ask about it. The year between the lease dispute and the summer of 1947 was a year of accumulation. not dramatic accumulation. Nothing that would have looked, to an outside observer, like the approach of serious conflict. The two families still went to the same church. They still acknowledged each other at the market in town. The social fabric of the Bayou community required a certain minimum of civil coexistence, and both families maintained that minimum with the specific, conscious effort of people who are managing something carefully. But underneath the management, things were moving. The Thibodaux family had lost approximately a third of their annual trapping income when the Marsh lease went to the Boudreaux. This was not ruinous. They had other lines, other resources. But it was real. It was felt every time the accounts came up short of where they should have been. It was felt in the specific, daily way that economic injury is felt in families that don't have a margin to absorb it easily. Rémi Thibodaux was 62 years old by the spring of 1947. He had spent 40 years building the family's trapping operation into the most respected in the parish. The lease dispute had cost him not only income, but something harder to quantify: standing. The knowledge, available to everyone on Bayou Cypremort, that the Thibodaux had been outmaneuvered on territory that had been theirs in practice for 2 decades. He did not speak about this often. He was not a man who complained. But Claude, his eldest son, watched his father over that year and saw something that he described many years later as a thing that happens to a man when he has decided something but has not yet decided what to do about it. A settling, a compression, like the air before a summer storm on the bayou, when everything goes still and close, and you can feel the pressure build without being able to see what's coming. Théo Thibodaux was less patient than his father. Théo had been working the marsh that was now, legally, Boudreaux territory. He had been working it under the terms of an informal arrangement. The Boudreaux had not immediately excluded the Thibodaux from the land. There had been a tacit understanding that things would continue roughly as they had while the situation settled. But tacit was not contractual, and by the fall of 1946 the tacit understanding had begun to fray at the edges. Marcel Boudreaux, methodical, business-minded, not unkind but focused on the operation in a way that left less room for sentiment than his father, had begun to enforce the lease boundaries more closely, not aggressively, but clearly. Lines that had been approximate were now specific. Areas that the Thibodaux had worked freely were now areas where Marcel would appear, politely but pointedly, and note that this side of the line was Boudreaux territory. Théo encountered Marcel at one of these boundary assertions in November of 1946. The exchange was brief. Marcel was polite. Théo was not entirely, though he kept himself controlled. He drove home. He spoke to his brother Claude about it. Claude said, "Let it go, Théo. Papa's handling it." Théo said, "Papa's not handling anything." He went and talked to Dodo, and Dodo said what he said, and nothing changed. Claude said, "Give it time." Théo looked at his brother. "How much time?" he said. "Another year? Another lease? Until we got nothing left down there." Claude didn't have an answer that satisfied. Théo drove back out to the boundary line that evening and ran his traps on the Boudreaux side of it. This was the beginning. The winter trapping season of 1946 to 47 produced a series of small confrontations along the Boudreaux-Thibodaux boundary that both families' accounts acknowledge, though they disagree on the sequence and the responsibility. Théo Thibodaux ran traps on Boudreaux lease territory. Marcel Boudreaux pulled them and left them on the road. Théo re-ran them. Marcel pulled them again, and this time, in addition to leaving them on the road, filed a complaint with the Parish Trapping Authority, a largely ceremonial body with limited enforcement power but the ability to create an official record. The complaint created a record. It also created an escalation, because filing a complaint with an official body was, in the social vocabulary of Bayou Cypremort, a specific kind of act. It meant you were done with the private resolution of private matters. It meant you had decided that the thing at issue was worth the exposure of official attention. Rémi Thibodaux heard about the complaint and went to see Dodo for the second time. This conversation was shorter than the first. Rémi said, "Your boy filed a paper on my boy." Dodo said, "My boy filed a paper on whoever was running traps on our lease." Rémi said, "That marsh has been ours as much as yours for 20 years. Dodo said, "The lease says different." Rémi said, "The lease says what you made it say." Dodo looked at his oldest neighbor, the man he had known since both of them were boys on this bayou, the man whose wedding he had attended and whose wife he had helped bury and whose children he had watched grow up 50 yards from his own children. And he said nothing. The silence was its own kind of answer. Rémi Thibodaux turned and walked back up the road. What changed in the spring of 1947 was Théo. Not his anger. The anger had always been there, and the preceding months had not diminished it. What changed was the direction it was pointed. Through the winter, Théo had been directing his frustration at the property line, at the traps, at the marsh, at the economic fact of the lease. He had been fighting the argument that his father and Marcel were having, just in a more physical register. In March of 1947, he stopped fighting the argument and started fighting the man. The man was Marcel Boudreaux. Marcel was 41 years old, the operating head of the Boudreaux fishing and trapping concern, and the person most visibly responsible for enforcing the lease boundary. He was not the person who had signed the lease. That was Dodo, but he was the face of the enforcement, the one Théo encountered at the line, the one whose polite firmness had been, month by month, wearing through whatever remained of Théo's patience. On the morning of March 11, 1947, Théo Thibodaux waited for Marcel Boudreaux at a spot on the Bayou Road where Marcel drove every morning on his way to the dock. He was alone. He did not have a weapon. What he had was size. He was a large man, physically formidable in the way of men who have spent their lives in the physical work of the swamp, and the specific quality of a man who has decided something and is done with thinking about it. When Marcel's truck came around the bend, Théo stepped into the road. Marcel stopped. What happened in the next several minutes was a fight. A serious one, not the kind that ends with a handshake and bruised dignity, the kind that ends with one man unable to stand. Marcel Boudreaux drove himself to the hospital in Franklin after it was over. He had a broken nose, 2 broken ribs, and significant bruising across his face and chest that the doctor documented without comment, because the doctor in St. Mary Parish in 1947 had long since made his peace with documenting things without comment. Marcel spent 2 days in the hospital. He did not report the incident to the sheriff. He drove home. He told his father what had happened. He told in a way that the Boudreaux men told difficult things. Briefly, without embellishment, with the flat effect of men who have already processed emotion internally and are now simply communicating the facts. Dodo Boudreaux listened. He asked one question, "Are you all right?" Marcel said yes. Dodo nodded. He went inside. He sat in his kitchen for a long time. Edouard Dodo Boudreaux was 64 years old in the spring of 1947. He had been on Bayou Cypremort his entire life. He had been born in a house 300 yards from where he currently lived, in a house that no longer stood, but whose foundation was still visible in the ground beside the water. He had learned to fish from his father and to trap from his grandfather, and to navigate the bayou in the dark by the sound of the water moving past the cypress knees and the specific quality of the night air in different sections of the marsh. He was not, by any reasonable description, a bad man. The people of the parish, when asked to describe him in later years, describe him consistently: a hard worker, a good Catholic, a man who kept his word in most things and who was respected in the community for the specific reliability that 60 years on the bayou had built into him. The lease was the thing that his son's children, who inherited the story, wrestled with, whether it was a betrayal or a business decision, whether Rémi Thibodaux had genuinely offered courtesy and been outmaneuvered, or whether New Orleans man had simply come to Dodo first and Dodo had done what any man in his position would have done. Dodo himself never explained it directly. He was, in his generation's fashion, not a man who explained his decisions. He made them and lived with them and expected others to accept that this was how things went. But Marcel, his son, said once, in old age, to one of his grandchildren who was asking about that time, that in the spring of 1947, after Théo put him in the hospital, his father had a quality about him that Marcel had seen only one other time. The year Odette died. A man making a calculation about loss, about what had been lost and what further loss was acceptable and what further loss was not. He was deciding something, Marcel said. He just hadn't told anyone yet what it was. Fernand, the younger son, went to his father 3 days after Marcel came home from the hospital. Fernand was the more inward of the 2 brothers. the one who sat on the porch and listened to frogs, the one who felt things that Marcel processed by working them out in action. He had his own sense of what had happened and what it meant, and he carried it differently than Marcel. He said to his father, "Papa, this is going somewhere we don't want it to go." Dodo said, "Maybe." Fernand said, "Maybe isn't good enough. Thibodaux put Marcel in the hospital. If that doesn't stop, somebody's going to do something that can't be undone." Dodo said, "What would you have me do?" Fernand said, "Go to Rémi. Give him something. The Marsh isn't worth what this is going to cost." Dodo was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "If I give back the Marsh, what does it say about everything else? What does it say about the next time someone decides they want something of ours?" Fernand said, "It says we're reasonable people." Dodo said, "Reasonable people get taken from." Fernand looked at his father. He saw the thing that Marcel had seen, the man who had decided something and was carrying it alone. He said, "Papa, what are you going to do?" Dodo said, "What needs doing." He didn't say what that was. Fernand drove home that night with the specific dread of a man who has seen where something is headed and has not been able to turn it. What happened in the summer of 1947 along Bayou Cypremort occurred across 3 separate incidents in June and July, which is the way these things typically occur. Not as a single climactic event, but as a series of escalations, each one responding to the previous, each one raising the ceiling of what was possible. The first was in June. Thibodaux's boat, a flat-bottomed pirogue that was his primary working vessel, that he had built himself over the course of 3 years. That was, in the practical economy of a trapper's life, his livelihood, was found at the dock with the hull staved in, not damaged by weather or accident, deliberately holed, with something heavy and pointed, in 4 places below the waterline. Theo found it on a Monday morning. He stood at the dock for a long time. Then he pulled the boat out and looked at the damage, and understood exactly what it was and what it meant. He drove to his father's house. Rémi Thibodaux looked at his youngest son's face and said, "What?" Theo said, "My boat." Rémi closed his eyes briefly. Then he opened them. He said, "Show me." He looked at the damage. He ran his fingers along the holes. He was quiet for a long time. Claude was there. Alcide was there. All 3 sons watching their father kneel by the ruined boat in the morning light. Rémi stood up. He said, "I'm going to talk to Dodo." Theo said, "Papa." Rémi said, "I'm going to talk to Dodo." The authority in his voice was the authority of a man who has made a final decision about how something will proceed, and it held all 3 sons without a word more being necessary. The conversation between Rémi Thibodaux and Dodo Boudreaux on that June morning was the third and last direct conversation between the 2 patriarchs, and the only one for which there exists something approaching a first-hand account. Not from the men themselves, neither of whom discussed it, but from Fernand Boudreaux, who was in the house when Rémi arrived and who listened from the next room. Rémi came in. He sat down. He said, "Dodo, somebody hold Theo's boat." Dodo said, "I'm sorry to hear that." The quality of the silence that followed was, Fernand said, the most uncomfortable silence he had ever been in the presence of, more uncomfortable than anything he had experienced before or after, because it contained 2 men who had known each other 60 years, and who were both fully aware of what the silence meant, and neither of whom was willing to be the one to name it. Finally, Rémi said, "Did your boys do this?" Dodo said, "No." Rémi said, "Will you look me in the eyes and tell me that?" Dodo looked at him. He said, "No." A single word, which was not a denial, which was a refusal to continue the conversation on those terms, which was, in the specific vocabulary of 2 men who had known each other for 60 years, something much more precise than it appeared. Rémi Thibodaux stood up. He put on his hat. He said, "Then we're done talking, Dodo." He walked out. Fernand heard the door close. He heard his father, in the kitchen, not moving. He stayed in the next room. He did not go in. Theo Thibodaux was 29 years old in July of 1947. He was the youngest son. He was vita in cholera, quick to anger, in a way that the family had managed for 29 years. He was the son who had put Marcel Boudreaux in the hospital in March. He was the son who had been running traps across the lease boundary since the previous fall. He was the son for whom the boat, specifically, was a thing that moved the situation from property dispute to personal injury. He had not built his father's trapping operation. He had not negotiated the informal Marsh sharing agreement that had held for 20 years. He had not, at 29, lived through enough of the cycles of friction and resolution that Rémi and Dodo had navigated for 6 decades to fully understand that some things, once they cross a certain threshold, cannot be navigated back. He understood that his boat had been destroyed. He understood that the man across the bayou had sat in his father's kitchen and said no when asked to deny it. He understood, with a specific, focused clarity of a young man whose anger had been building for a year and had just been confirmed and ratified by the most credible possible source, what he was going to do. He did not tell his father. He did not tell Claude or Alcide. He waited 3 days. Then, on a Thursday evening in July, he crossed the bayou. What happened on that Thursday evening was serious. Serious enough that the St. Mary Parish Sheriff's Department, which had been maintained at the edges of the Boudreaux Thibodaux situation for months, was finally drawn in. Théo Thibodaux found Fernand Boudreaux, alone on the dock below the Boudreaux house, working on the outboard motor of the family's fishing boat. In the early evening, when the light on the bayou was long and gold and the mosquitoes were beginning to move, Fernand was not Marcel. Fernand had not enforced the lease boundary. Fernand had not, as far as anyone has ever been able to establish, been involved in the holding of Théo's pirogue. Fernand was the one who had gone to his father and said, "This is going somewhere we don't want it to go." He was the wrong man. He was the man who was there. Théo hit him twice. Fernand went into the water, the shallow, dark water at the edge of the dock, where the bottom was mud and cypress root. He went in and did not immediately come up, and when he came up he was face down and not moving. The water was 18 inches deep. Fernand Boudreaux did not drown. He was pulled out by Théo, who, and this detail matters because it tells you something about the specific confused moral territory that Théo Thibodaux was operating in, did not leave. He pulled Fernand out of the water and turned him over and established that he was breathing, and then sat back on the dock in the evening light next to the man he had just beaten unconscious and waited. Waited until Marcel came looking for his brother 20 minutes later. Marcel found Théo sitting on the dock with Fernand. He took in the scene. Théo looked at Marcel. He said, "We're even." Then he stood up and walked back across the bayou. Marcel called the sheriff. The St. Mary Parish Sheriff's Department was not unfamiliar with the Boudreaux and Thibodaux families. The sheriff in 1947 was a man named Broussard, first name Gaston, third-generation St. Mary Parish, Cajun himself, who understood exactly what kind of situation he was walking into when he drove the Bayou Road on the evening of July 17, 1947. He had handled disputes between Bayou families before. He had handled the particular dynamics of communities where the official law was regarded as a useful tool in certain circumstances and as an intrusion in others, and where the line between those categories was drawn by the community rather than the law. He had not handled something that had put a man in the bayou. Fernand Boudreaux was taken to the hospital in Franklin. He had a concussion and water in his lungs. Not enough to be life-threatening, but enough to require 2 days of observation. The doctor's report noted the injuries with the same documentary precision that the previous doctor had applied to Marcel's broken ribs. Sheriff Broussard interviewed Marcel at the hospital. Marcel told him what he had found. He named Théo Thibodaux. Broussard drove to the Thibodaux property. Rémi met him at the gate. Broussard said, "Rémi, I need to talk to Théo." Rémi said, "He's inside." Broussard said, "Is he going to talk to me?" Rémi said, "He'll do what I tell him." He called Théo out. Théo sat across from Broussard on the porch of the Thibodaux house, in the dark, with the bayou sound around them, and he did not deny what he had done. He said he had done it. He said why. He said he expected to face whatever he was going to face. Broussard arrested him. Théo was charged with aggravated battery, a serious charge, potentially a felony, in Louisiana in 1947. He spent the night in the parish jail. The following morning, Rémi Thibodaux went to see a lawyer in Franklin. The legal proceedings that followed the July arrest were the first point at which the Boudreaux-Thibodaux conflict became officially documented in a way that has left a retrievable record. The district attorney assigned to the case was a young man from Morgan City who was competent and overworked, and who saw in the Thibodaux case a straightforward aggravated battery with a named perpetrator who had confessed, which was, in the context of his caseload, almost refreshing in its clarity. What the DA did not see initially was the context. The lease, the trap lines, Marcel's March hospitalization, the boat. He did not see the 60 years of shared Bayou country, or the accumulated grievances of a year, or the specific logic of community, where these things worked out in ways that didn't always produce police reports. He saw a battery. He prepared to prosecute it. And then Fernand Boudreaux, from his hospital bed, told the sheriff that he did not wish to pursue the charge. Fernand said, "This is a family matter. It goes back a long way. I want it to be handled like a family matter." Sheriff Broussard communicated this to the DA. The DA, young, from Morgan City, not quite understanding, said, "He nearly drowned." Broussard said, "I know that. He still doesn't want to press it." The DA dropped the aggravated battery. He retained a lesser charge, simple battery, which did not require the victim's cooperation. Théo Thibodaux pled guilty in October of 1947. He was fined and placed on 1 year of supervised probation. He did not go to prison. The legal resolution satisfied nobody. The Boudreaux felt that Théo had gotten away with what he had done, that a man who put Marcel in the hospital in March and Fernand in the Bayou in July had received a fine and supervision, which in the Boudreaux accounting was not justice. The Thibodaux felt, Rémi felt, specifically, that the legal involvement itself had been a humiliation, that the family's private matter had been exposed to official scrutiny in a way that left a public record of his son's actions and his family's dispute, and that this exposure was itself a kind of injury. Both families were right from their own position. Both families were dissatisfied. And dissatisfied families with unresolved grievances do not simply absorb the dissatisfaction and continue. They sit with it. They decide. The ending of the Boudreaux-Thibodaux conflict was not dramatic. This is true of most actual conflicts, as opposed to the dramatized versions. They do not end at a single moment of climactic confrontation. They wind down. They exhaust themselves. The people in them find, eventually, that the cost of continuing exceeds whatever continuing was for. What ended the active phase of the conflict was a combination of legal pressure, family intervention, and the specific geography of the Bayou country, which provided the Thibodaux family with an exit that more landlocked community might not have offered. In the fall of 1947, Alcide Thibodaux, the middle son, the one who had processed and sold the pelts, the one who was most connected to the commercial side of the operation, accepted a job with a larger trapping company based in Terrebonne Parish, 40 miles to the east. It was a good job, a real step up in the commercial operation, a serious for a business. It required him to relocate. He relocated. Théo, on supervised probation, followed his brother to Terrebonne in early 1948, finding work with the same company. Whether the relocation was entirely voluntary, whether there was family pressure from Rémi to remove his most volatile son from the immediate vicinity of the Boudreaux, is not documented. Both Alcide and Théo, in subsequent years, describe the move as a professional opportunity. Whether it was also a strategic removal is the kind of question that these families answer with silence. Claude, the eldest, stayed. He stayed on the bayou and ran what remained of the Thibodaux trapping operation, and managed his father through the last years of Rémi's life with the specific competence and the specific fatigue of an eldest son who has spent years being the responsible one in a situation where responsibility produced limited reward. Rémi Thibodaux died in 1953 at the age of 67. He died knowing that the Marsh lease had never been returned, that Théo had pled guilty in a public court, that 2 of his 3 sons had left the bayou. Whether he died satisfied with how he had handled it, or regretful, or simply accepting of the way things had gone, that is not known. He was not a man who explained his feelings. He was from a generation, and a culture that did not. He is buried in the Catholic cemetery in Charenton. His stone is gray and weathered, the letters still readable. Dodo Boudreaux outlived Rémi by 4 years, dying in 1957 at the age of 74. He spent those last years as he had spent most of his years, on the bayou, fishing, sitting on his porch in the evenings, attending the Friday night dances less frequently as his legs weakened. He did not speak. to any recorded account about the lease or the conflict or what had happened between the families, in the community, in the parish. The general knowledge of what had occurred was present but unvoiced. The specific discretion of people who understand that some things are known without being spoken. Marcel ran the Boudreaux operation until the oil field work that had supplemented the family's income for 20 years became the primary income, as the post-war oil expansion in the Louisiana wetlands accelerated through the 1950s and 60s. He worked the platforms. He managed the family's land. He walked with a slight stiffness that 2 broken ribs in 1947 had left in his side in cold weather, which was a daily, low-level reminder of a morning on a bayou road that he had, over the years, reached something like acceptance of. He died in 1998. He was 92 years old. He had outlived almost everyone in this story. Fernand, the quieter brother, the one who had tried to stop it, lived until 2001. He was 94. He gardened. He fished. He visited his grandchildren on the weekends. He had headaches, occasionally, that he attributed to the fall on the dock in July of 1947. They were not debilitating. They were there. He never spoke about Théo Thibodaux by name. In his old age, when the grandchildren asked about the family history, he talked about the bayou and the fishing and the old way of life on the water. He talked about his father. He talked about the food his mother had made and the music at the Friday dances. He did not talk about the dock. Some things you keep. Bayou Cypremort is still there. It is narrower in some places than it was in 1947, the result of the specific hydrological changes that the oil industry and the levee system and the subsidence of the Louisiana coastal landscape have produced across the past 80 years. The cypress trees are older. The Spanish moss is the same. It is always the same. The water is the same dark color, the same slow movement, the same patience. The Boudreaux family is still in St. Mary Parish. Grandchildren, great-grandchildren of Marcel and Fernand, living the lives that the 21st century offers in rural Louisiana. Some in the oil industry, some in fishing, some working jobs in Morgan City or Lafayette, and driving back to the bayou on weekends. The Thibodaux line in St. Mary Parish largely disappeared with the departure of Alcide and Théo to Terrebonne. Claude's children stayed in the parish for a generation, and then followed the general drift of Cajun communities into the moderate-sized cities of South Louisiana, Lafayette and Baton Rouge and New Orleans, carrying the name and the French and the specific music and food and community of the Bayou country into urban contexts that received it with varying degrees of comprehension. The Marsh lease that started it all, the 400 acres of muskrat and nutria habitat on Bayou Cypremort, was eventually worth considerably more than the fur company paid for it. When the oil companies arrived in the late 1950s and began looking at what lay beneath, the Boudreaux received that value. The lease and its subsequent conversions remained in the family. Whether this was justice or simply the way things went in a world where some people get to the table first, that is the question that the Thibodaux descendants, those who know the story, have been sitting with for 70 years. The bayou doesn't answer questions like that. The bayou moves. The moss hangs. The light on the water in the morning is the same light it has always been, gray and cool and filtered to the cypresses, arriving change, arriving beautiful, arriving with no memory of what passed beneath it and no concern for what will pass next. The Boudreaux. The Thibodaux. St. Mary Parish, Louisiana. 1947. A Marsh lease. 3 years of accumulating injury. 1 probation. No deaths. No heroes. Just a bayou. Just the water. Just a long, patient, moss-hung fact of a place that holds its people the way it holds its trees, in water that shouldn't support roots, holding nevertheless. Rémi Thibodaux was, by every account, a man of considerable discipline, not the aggressive discipline of a man fighting his own nature, but the organic discipline of a man whose nature and his chosen way of life had grown together so completely over 61 years that the two were indistinguishable. He was a trapper. Trapping requires patience. It requires the ability to read landscape and weather and animal behavior with an attention that does not announce itself, that simply accumulates over years of quiet observation until the reading becomes automatic, as natural as breathing. He brought this quality to everything, to the family operation, which he ran with precision that his sons respected and found occasionally suffocating, to the Bayou community, where he was regarded as a man you could trust to say what he meant and mean what he said, and not complicate either with ambiguity, to his relationship with Dodo Boudreaux, which had been, for most of his adult life, a model of exactly the kind of management that makes long-term proximity between competing interests work. The lease was the thing that broke the model, not because Rémi was incapable of absorbing an economic loss. He had absorbed others in the Depression years, in the bad trapping seasons. But because this particular loss arrived freighted with something that economic losses do not always carry, the implication of bad faith. If Dodo had simply outmaneuvered him in a neutral competition, if the New Orleans man had come to both doors simultaneously and Dodo had simply moved faster, Rémi could have absorbed that. It would have stung. He would have been angry, but he would have been able to frame it as fair competition and find a way to accept it. What he could not fully accept, what sat in him to the fall and winter and into spring with a weight that the discipline could not entirely contain, was the possibility that it had not been neutral, that Dodo had moved without telling him, that 60 years of shared water and shared work and shared Catholic faith had not produced, in Dodo, enough of a sense of obligation to pick up a telephone before signing. This possibility was not certainty. He had no proof of it. Dodo's answer in the kitchen, "I did what was available to me," was not a confession. It was a statement that could be read either way. Rémi read it one way, and the reading changed him. Claude, the eldest son, watched his father through the year between the lease and the summer of 1947, and what he watched was a man processing a specific kind of betrayal, specific because it came from someone you had trusted, and because the trust had been so long-standing that the betrayal did not feel like an event, but like a retroactive revision of everything that had come before it. 60 years of neighborly reliability, Claude thought, watching his father at the dinner table, watching him on the trap line, watching him at the Sunday Mass where he still sat 3 pews from the Boudreaux without looking at them, 60 years suddenly existing under a question mark. Had it been real? Had Dodo always been this man, the man who would take what was available without the courtesy of a conversation? And had they simply not seen it until now? Claude did not voice this question to his father. He knew his father had been sitting with it himself and had arrived at whatever answer he was going to arrive at, and that the answer was shaping his behavior in ways that Claude watched with increasing concern. What Claude saw in his father, across that year, was a man constructing an architecture of response. Slow, methodical, patient. The way Rémi Thibodaux did everything. Not impulsive. Not hot, but not forgiving either. He was building towards something. Claude was not sure his father knew exactly what. Neither was Rémi. But it was building. The people of Bayou Cypremort and the surrounding St. Mary Parish communities were aware of the dispute between the Boudreaux and Thibodaux families from almost the moment it began. This was inevitable. The Bayou communities of South Louisiana in 1947 were small, interconnected, and possessed of information networks of extraordinary efficiency, not telephone networks. Many of the Bayou households did not have telephones, but the networks of church, of market, of the Friday night dances, of the specific passing conversations that happen when people see each other on narrow roads and stop their vehicles and talk through open windows. These networks moved information with a speed and a completeness that would have surprised people who lived in larger, more anonymous places. Everyone knew about the lease. Everyone knew that Rémi had not been consulted before Dodo signed. Everyone had an opinion about whether that constituted bad faith, and the opinions divided roughly along the lines you would expect. People closer to Boudreaux found reasons to read it charitably. People closer to the Thibodaux found reasons not to. The people in the middle, which was most of the community, found it uncomfortable and hoped it would resolve itself without becoming something worse. The priest at the parish church in Charenton, a man named Père Arsenault, who had been serving the Bayou Cypremort community for 15 years and who knew both families with a thorough, intimate knowledge of a confessor and a neighbor, was aware of the situation and had attempted, through the indirect mechanisms available to a Louisiana Catholic priest, to encourage resolution. He had spoken to Dodo about generosity. Dodo had listened politely and said nothing specific. He had spoken to Rémi about forgiveness. Rémi had listened and said he was working on it. Neither conversation produced observable change, and Père Arsenault, who was a realist as well as a priest and understood that the instruments of the church worked on souls that were open to them and had limited application to souls that had decided something, accepted the limits of his influence, and continued to watch and hope. The women of the community occupied a particular position in all of this. The wives of the Boudreaux and Thibodaux men, Marcel's wife Georgette, Fernand's girlfriend who would become his wife in 1949, Claude's wife Elodie, all navigated the social landscape of the conflict with the specific skills that women in these communities had developed over generations of managing the consequences of men's decisions. They still spoke to each other, not warmly, not the way they had spoken the year before, with the ease of women who shared community and shared cooking traditions and shared the specific knowledge of which households were doing well and which were struggling. But they spoke, briefly, carefully, in the neutral register of women who had decided that the men's dispute does not entirely have to be their dispute and who are managing the social calendar of the community with the specific pragmatism that the community required. Georgette Boudreaux, Marcel's wife, a woman from a family in Patterson who had married into the Bayou country and understood it without having been entirely formed by it, was the most direct about the situation of any of the women connected to it. She told Marcel more than once that the Marsh was not worth what the conflict was costing, that the money from the lease was real, but the damage to the community was real too, and that she could see the damage in the faces of people she had known for 15 years every time she went to church or to the market. Marcel heard her. He was not unsympathetic. He said the decision had been made. She said decisions could be unmade. He said some couldn't. She stopped arguing, but she kept watching. And what she watched through the spring and summer of 1947 was a specific trajectory of something heading to a point of no return, and the specific helplessness of someone who can see the trajectory clearly and cannot change it. Elodie Thibodaux, Claude's wife, 33 years old, the daughter of a Cajun family from the Terrebonne Parish area who had married into the St. Mary Parish community in 1937, had a different experience of conflict, filtered through her husband's. Positioned as the eldest and most responsible Thibodaux son, Claude was, as has been noted, the one who managed. He managed the trapping operation, the family finances, and increasingly, in the year between the lease and the summer of 1947, the emotional temperature of his family, specifically his brother Théo, who was a valve through which the family's pressure was most visibly expressing itself. Elodie watched Claude manage and knew what it was costing him. He was sleeping less. He was eating less. He came home from the trap line some evenings with the look of a man who had been carrying something heavy all day and had not been able to put it down. She said to him, one evening in the early summer, "Claude, your father has to let this go, or something bad is going to happen." Claude said, "I know." She said, "Does he know?" Claude said, "He knows. He's just not ready." Elodie said, "Before Théo does something he can't undo?" Claude didn't answer. 2 weeks later, Théo crossed the bayou. Fernand Boudreaux spent 2 days in the hospital following the dock incident in July 1947. He had a concussion. He had water in his lungs. He had the specific experience of having gone into water unconscious and come back out alive because a man who put him there had, at the last moment, pulled him out, which is a complicated experience to process, and one that Fernand processed in a particular way. He processed most things, quietly, over a long period of time, without discussing it with anyone except his brother and, eventually, his wife. Fernand was, as has been established, the member of the Boudreaux family who had tried to stop what was coming. He had gone to his father and said, "This is going somewhere we don't want it to go." He had argued for giving back some portion of the marsh. He had been the voice of de-escalation in a family that, led by Marcel's practical firmness and Dodo's deeper movability, was not particularly interested in de-escalation, and he had been the one put in the water. This is a particular irony that Fernand himself acknowledged in old age to his grandchildren, not with bitterness, but with the specific equanimity of a man who has had decades to understand that the world does not distribute its consequences with any particular regard for whether the recipient has earned them. He had not earned the dock. He had received it anyway. What Fernand felt about Théo Thibodaux across the 54 years between the dock and Fernand's death in 2001 was not hatred. He was consistent about this, on the rare occasions when the subject came up in the later years. He was not interested in hatred. He had decided, somewhere in the hospital days or in the years immediately following, that hatred required an ongoing investment of energy that he was not willing to make. What he felt was more specific than hatred. It was a kind of sorrow for Théo, whom he did not blame in the simple way that blame usually works, because he understood intellectually the shape of what had driven Théo to the dock that evening. He understood the trajectory of the conflict. He understood that Théo was not a bad man, but a young man compressed by circumstances into a specific kind of fury that had found him as its nearest available target. He understood it. He did not forgive it. Or rather, and this is a distinction that Fernand himself would have insisted on, he forgave the act because his faith required forgiveness of acts, but he could not forgive the specific quality of the randomness, that it had been him rather than Marcel, that the anger had landed on the person in the family who had been most opposed to the situation that had generated the anger. That particular irony, he said, was a thing he never fully made peace with, but he made peace with everything else. He fished. He gardened. He was, by all accounts of those who knew him in his later years, a man of considerable contentment. The contentment not of someone who had received everything he wanted, but of someone who had found, in the life available to him, enough to be grateful for. He was 94 when he died. The headaches, occasionally. The memory of the water, occasionally. Otherwise, the bayou, the light on the moss, the smell of the cypress, the sound of frogs in the evenings. Enough. More than enough. Théo Thibodaux moved to Terrebonne Parish in early 1948, following Alcide to the larger trapping company and the different geography and the specific relief of putting distance between himself and the Bayou Road where he had waited for Marcel that March morning. He was 29 years old. He was on supervised probation. He was, by the accounts of people who knew him in Terrebonne, quieter than a young man who had arrived in St. Mary Parish from the military in the mid-1940s, a different kind of quiet from the family's sense of him as veit and cholera. The anger was still there, but it had been through something that had changed its texture. He had put a man in the water. He had pulled him out. He had sat on the dock and waited. That sequence, the violence, the retrieval, the waiting, was something Théo Thibodaux returned to in his own private accounting for the rest of his life, not with the particular torture of someone who has done something they consider irredeemably wrong. He did not believe it was irredeemable, or perhaps he could not afford to believe it was irredeemable, but with the specific awareness of a man who has passed through a threshold and cannot pass back through it. He had hit Fernand Boudreaux. He had put him in the water. And in the moment when he looked at Fernand face down in 18 inches of bayou water and understood what he had done and what it was about to mean, he had reached in and pulled him out. The reaching in was the thing he held on to, not as justification. He was not the kind of man who worked backward from his better acts to excuse his worse ones, but as a fact about himself. A fact that suggested, even in the worst of it, that some part of him had been watching from outside and had been prepared to stop something irreversible from completing itself. That was the man he wanted to be. Whether the man he had been on that dock had earned the right to be him, that was the question he never fully answered. He married in Terrebonne in 1951. He had 3 children. He worked the trapping company for 12 years and then, when the industry shifted, moved into the oil field work that was consuming South Louisiana's workforce through the 1950s and 60s. He came back to St. Mary Parish exactly once, in 1965, for his father's funeral. He stood at the grave in the Catholic cemetery in Charenton and looked at his father's stone and did not speak to the people around him more than was necessary. He looked, once, across the cemetery to where the Boudreaux family was gathered around a different part of the grounds, attending the burial of someone of their own. He looked. He did not go over. They did not come over. The distance between them was perhaps 100 yards. The distance between them was everything that had happened since 1946. He turned back to his father's grave. He stood there until the priest finished. Then he drove back to Terrebonne. He died in 1989, at the age of 71, of a heart condition. His children, when asked about the family history, said they knew there had been trouble once, back in St. Mary Parish. Something about a Marsh lease, something that their father didn't talk about. They knew the shape of it. They didn't know the dock. Théo had not told them. Some things you keep,